Hi, I'm Stella Treese, Chief of Staff to Sid, CEO of GitLab.
And I'm Sid C. Brandy, co-founder CEO at GitLab. And we're also joined by Quinn from SourceGraph. And we're going to discuss the partnership between the Chief of Staff and CEO. Quinn.
All right, thanks, Sid and Stella. So this also came about because Sid and I were talking over dinner, and I have just hired a Chief of Staff, CEO of SourceGraph, and I was asking Sid, how do you work with a Chief of Staff? And he said, well, in keeping with the value of transparency, let's all talk about this on a live stream so that everyone can benefit from this. So that's why we're here. And my first question is exactly what I asked you at dinner, Sid. And I'd love to hear this from Stella as well. How do you work with your Chief of Staff? What's an average day? And then what do you look to, get out of the relationship and partnership over a longer period of time?
Yeah, so I think what's really important is that a Chief of Staff is not an EBA, it's not a business administrator. It's someone who kind of runs the function for everything that doesn't belong in a function. So GitLab is functionally organized. We got legal and finance and everything else. They all have their execs, but there is certain work that where there's not a clear kind of place in the organization to put it. And it ends up on the CEO plate. And then the CEO plate is like the Chief of Staff team. Like that's the team that helps with that. And that's in GitLab's case, we're now over about 1,500 people. It's not just Stella's Chief of Staff, but the team she's assembled with kind of our internal strategy consultants, with engineers that kind of support me. And it's the place for all those multifunctional things that are not picked up by any separate, any functional part of the organization. Stella, I'm sure you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think I'll start by saying GitLab is a very intentional model. And one of the things that was really appealing to me when I interviewed for this role is it was very well thought about in terms of there's directive work you're going to do, and then there's also kind of broader strategic work you're going to do. But I have noticed there's like a whole spectrum. Chief of Staff can be an EBA. And you do find those Chief of Staffs who are recent college graduates and someone pulls them in, and that's really their need as a CEO or whatever level. And then there's ones who actually run like big parts of a company. There's precedence for that. So the key thing is like, what do you need and what do you want? And what is that gap for you? But I think specifically to how we've been working, what I have appreciated is that it's really driven by kind of Sid and his needs and where the gaps are. For instance, if someone is no longer able to perform the role within executive communication, someone from my team could be great, like we'll lean in, we'll help here. Or there could be something more ongoing like OKRs that doesn't have a direct home and is always cross-functional, where I can lean in or my team can lean in. So there's real responsibility. It reaches all parts of the organization. It keeps things moving, and it is that ultimate gap filler. And there always is a gap, especially as a company grows. Probably even more when it's early stage, because Chief of Staffs tend to be generalists. Not always. That kind of goes back to what does the CEO need? What is the complement for the CEO? But they're usually people who can jump in when there's a hole and help plug it.
Cool. So Sid, what was it that made you realize I really want to bring on a Chief of Staff?
It's when you have those projects that don't belong anywhere and you're like, wait a second, I have to do this myself. I'm not just CEO, but I also like doing all that other stuff. That doesn't make sense. For example, there's an independent company in China that sells GitLab, that is a licensee of us. We have a stake in their company. That is a situation that's a relationship that needs management, and that doesn't belong in any specific part of GitLab. It touches finance, touches legal, touches sales, and everything else. And it's really kind of a CEO to CEO relationship with that company. But there's so much going on. I need help there, and that for example ended up in the Chief of Staff team.
So those just started to pile up enough so that they were interfering with the rest of your job?
Yeah, and think, for example, about OKRs. Like we said, we have a quarterly process to determine our goals. And it's very important to kind of think about that up front. What do I propose? What do my reports come back with? Make sure that we have that all aligned before the start of the quarter, so everyone knows what they're striving for. That's a whole process, and that requires a lot of knowledge about the company, requires making sure all those departments kind of deliver, and kind of back and forth and intelligent thinking about like how do we make this work? The demands from me as a CEO, but the demands also of the different functions, and putting that together. And there's only so many hours in a day, and Stella and team can do a great job there. What's also been kind of a recent but very positive development been the kind of the internal strategy consultants, people at director level are available if there's something that is going wrong. We continually have things that require attention, and what you don't want to do is like take people who already have a full-time workload and then give them something else on top of that. That's not fair to them. But across kind of the 7 functions we have at GitLab, like you got 1 or 2 or 3 of these things go on at any given time. With these directors, they are available immediately to jump in and help out in a situation. And that's become increasingly useful.
So one, there's construction going on. I'm going to fix that right after this. Let's go off video. But for Stella, what were you looking for in the CEO that you wanted to work with? And in general, what do CEOs need to do after they've been, kind of on their own, running a company and bring on a chief of staff? What do they need to give up? How do they need to work well and change what they do to work well with the chief of staff?
Oh, I think Sid is so transparent in who he is. If you look at the CEO page in GitLab handbook, you will see his flaws. So I was in a very privileged position, and that I felt through the interview process, through just Sid being out there, I was very clear about what the scope of the role was and what it'd be like to work with him. And that's something that I felt very comfortable with going into. So it's been very smooth there. I think what's hard as a chief of staff, and is something that I just need to be cognizant of and I'm always navigating through, is it is always a very changing landscape. As the company matures, especially as a functionally oriented organization, as things move into different pockets and functions as they should, what you own changes over time. So I think that that's something that Sid and I are always having conversations around, like what is with chief of staff, what moves off of it, how do we do it in the right ways? So I think those are some of the interesting conversations we navigate toward. But I came in and Sid had a very clear vision for the role, and that was really helpful for getting started on the right things. And I think a key thing that we do is just make sure we're locked up every week around like, what am I focusing on? What is my team focusing on? Are these the right things? But generally we come to him and we say, this is what it is. And we just keep moving from there.
And when you say you set a clear vision for what he needed out of this role, was that the job description, a handbook page as of the time that you were hired?
Yeah, it is. We are very thoughtful. I think a lot of people throw together a job description and put it out there and don't really revisit it. For us, it's really a living document. So I'll still go through my team page. I'll still go through my own jobs page, and I'll say, like, does this reflect what I do? It's something I look at every quarter or so. And I like to say that most of it does, because it's a kind of signal to other people within GitLab. I know that people look at GitLab, so it's a signal for other chiefs of staffs who are asking like, hey, what does this person do? But we try to capture what we're actually working on. And when I showed up, those are things I worked on.
Sid, how did you know what to put on there?
Thanks for that. It's the job description I worked on longest, because it's really hard. And chief of staff is a term that can mean many things. So I wanted to nail it with this one. I think it came out really well between like how does this work? How does the rotation work? What are performance indicators? We even have like references to literature, which is uncommon in job descriptions. We have a video in the shadows. We'll add the current video we're making to this page as well. But what I'm most proud of is the updates. Like Stella and team keep it up to date as the function changes, as GitLab grows and as we learn things.
What have you learned?
For me,
That he no longer needs to brief CEO visitors on GitLab before they visit.
I was actually thinking, I think I made more updates recently, the chief of staff team page, which is a different but linked page. But it is one we're visiting, and we're actually having our first chief of staff team offsite in January, which I'm super excited about, because a key thing we want to do is like literally look at this handbook page and refresh it, because it is a good opportunity to rethink like what is our mission and vision. But for me, what I've learned goes back to that you just need to be really nimble, because the organization you join, if you're part of a fast growing company or a company that's going through any change, is that your job is going to change and your CEO's role is going to change. The CEO they need to be is going to be very different every 6 months. And I think for a chief of staff, you need to be nimble in the same way. You're going to find that new e-group members come on board and they have their own specialties. So where you need to lean in will be different. You'll find that there's new experts in things and you won't need that part of the role, but something else will change. So I think for me, it's less a specific learning, but more just like the opportunity to be part of different things and that kind of flexibility to continue to be successful.
So if I'm
for completeness, this is the chief of staff to the CEO page. Shadow is going to make sure that this is linked from the chief of staff job description. And as Stella indicated, that's continuously being updated.
Cool. That's awesome. I love how you can just look at the commit log for that page and see the learnings. So, okay, if I'm someone at GitLab and, maybe like a year ago or 2 years ago when GitLab is smaller, what kind of things do I go to Sid for? What kind of things do I go to Stella for?
That's a great question. I think a lot of things happen in the CEO Slack channel. So people can just post there, and then if Stella sees like, oh, I could probably handle this, you can handle it before I even.
So what kinds of things go in there?
Everything. It's a mix of, I read this thing, Sid, I really want your opinion on it, to here's something you can review, to I want to highlight something that's happening. Here's an MR, a merge request I'd like you to look at for a change I'm making. So it's lots of things. But I think that part of it is it changes as well. And it's partly why we're building out my team. So right now, like I can't look at that channel and monitor as much as I want to. So we had a moment of like, oh, that is important for my job. Like that's what we want this to be. So that's partly why I'm hiring another person to enable me to do more of that proactive work. But it's partly why it evolves. And you need to kind of revisit like, who is the team? What do we need for this team? And then what is the scope given what we currently have? There's so many things the team wants to work on, and there's limited time to do it.
Yeah. So I think Sid said there were engineers who were on the chief of staff team or, working with him. I would love to learn more about that. I'm very intrigued.
Yeah. So at GitLab, there's a lot of engineering going on, but there's some of the things that are very important, like a next generation architecture for our code base or something like that, or a new product offering or something like that. I get involved with things like that, but I found myself kind of sometimes not prepared enough, and I kind of shooting from the hip. Like I kind of had ideas, but I wasn't very articulate. I wasn't well prepped. I didn't understand it. So Stella hired an awesome person, Marshall, who I'm like now partnering with. And I asked like, hey, Marshall, can you look into this? Like, it's really weird that this thing is so low. Like, can you have a look? And I see this proposal, but I suspect this might be a good approach instead. Can you kind of look into that? And if so, can you make like a proposal that other people understand more easily than if I just spitball in a meeting? So that's been absolutely amazing. It's a very special role, takes a special person, but so far I'm extremely fortunate to be working with someone.
I think one thing that's Marshall's excelled at, and I think is really important for anyone in this role, is it is so inherently cross-functional, and you're always stepping into what someone else cares about. So a great example there is like Marshall's working really closely with product and engineering and inserting views that are Sid's or his own and having that back and forth. And it's a lot sometimes for a CEO to enter those meetings as well, especially if he's with more junior folks and saying, like, here's what I think. So it's nice if you find the right person, because they could be like the lighter person, someone who's a little bit more approachable perhaps from some of these things, and provide that kind of good cross-functional ideas and relationship building. So I think that's something we've been able to help some with. So Sid's not in all those meetings in the same way anymore.
Yeah. What should the chief of staff not be doing? What might the chief of staff do that would cause organizational problems or confusion, or would just not be a good thing for the chief of staff to be doing?
I mean, I think at GitLab, I would say not having the EDA work is very helpful. People, even now, admittedly so, because I have the EDA reporting into me, see the role sometimes as very administrative. So I think a tension we've had within GitLab is how do you make sure that you're sharing the high-end strategic operational work that you do, but also making sure the administrative things happen, because there's so much mix of work within the role. But making sure that you're not getting bogged down in like the calendaring and all those things, I think that's what's been really important for my team.
Yeah, for me, one lesson is like, don't use the chief of staff as a shield. Like if a report of mine is kind of pushing back on something, don't use like bringing the chief of staff as kind of like, get this done because you can't come to an agreement with your report. Don't put your chief of staff between me and a report. Chief of staff picks up work that otherwise wouldn't go addressed, or they coordinate functions, but they're not a layer between you and your reports.
And on the same lines, I think I was the first full chief of staff in this role. And I think something I learned is that you want to be the person who like goes and makes sure that the things that CEO wants is happening, but you also don't want to be seen as that person who is kind of rolling over people, isn't giving context, making things happen, but in a way that's like overbearing. And I think that there's some temptations for some chiefs of staff to be like, I hear the ask, I'm gonna get done really fast. And the efficiencies of GitLab value is very important. But I think it's also important to kind of be sensitive to who else needs to be brought along? Do I need to check the legal? Like what else needs to happen? And that's an important thing to be aware of as well.
Yeah, you're not the enforcer.
Yeah, beyond the enforcer, you're also not like the single person who needs to make things happen in a vacuum. Like there still is a broader organization, and getting things done effectively means bringing them along in the right way when needed.
So adding another person to the mix, I mean, the Mythical Man Month famously says you can't make a software project go faster by adding another person. Adding another person in the mix improves things, but it also creates opportunities for confusion, for miscommunication. So how do you solve for, cases where maybe, you two didn't go through all the details, and then, like you're not completely aligned? That can throw people off. It can confuse people, can make people worried about, is the strategy actually, for real? Have you encountered that, and how do you deal with that?
It's a good question, but I'm going to argue with your example. I think the Mythical Man Month says that it's hard to fix a software project that's late by throwing more people on it, because it takes time to ramp up those people. I do believe that like 2 times as many software engineers can get at least 50% more work done. But it needs some time. I think we've done a great job, but I could see there being a lot of light between what the chief of staff and the CEO. I think Stella has been exceptional and kind of understanding my drift, keeping me in the loop, asking me in when it's unclear. I don't think we've had that problem, but maybe Stella thinks otherwise.
I mean, I haven't seen it as a problem either. At GitLab, we're really good at talking about DRIs. And in my mind, like I am the chief of staff to Sid, which means I amplify him and help him do more, which means helping the business do more. So most things will, at the end of the day, come back to Sid as at least an FYI, if they're at any scale at all, because I want to keep him plugged in. It's good for him to have context, even if it's once a week. So few things ever happen really in a vacuum. And there are things that I'm a DRI on, but even those things are important enough that I'd usually be like, and by the way, OKRs are happening, and this is like what someone else pushed back on, and you're going to have this meeting on it, whatever it is. I think just with that open communication, it hasn't been an issue.
For people watching the stream, like DRI means directly responsible individual. It's kind of the owner of a certain task or project.
Thank you for that.
What big decisions were different because you had a chief of staff? Sid.
do want to continue in this role as a CEO of GitLab.
That's untrue, but very kind.
It's, if you look at, for example, Jihu, who sells GitLab in China, that's a lot of work. And it's only because Stella takes care of most of that I'm able to take on those opportunities. If I had to do everything, I would have just not done it. And that's the same with a lot of like strategically important engineering projects that Marshall helps me with, or Christine now helping out with a change. Like, as a CEO, you have a certain appetite. Like you always have more ideas than time, but like, where's the cutoff line? And without a chief of staff team, you're just gonna scale down your ambitions and not do these things that could have added a tremendous amount of value to the company.
That's right. A good example is we had someone who was going to write his Staster speech. Unfortunately, that person wasn't able to do it. So someone on my team can jump in, and I saw the recording today, and I was really excited about it. So it's not that it wouldn't have happened. Something would have happened, or maybe it wouldn't have happened, but just that quality is there. That ability to jump in and get things done is there. So there's that fallback that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah. Do you ever worry that like it enables you to take on too much?
Sid or me or both?
I'll answer that first. I think what you have to be afraid of is, what you have to be careful of is that you empower your reports. So we don't want to be taking away from my chief technology officer and everyone else who reports to me. I think we've been pretty good at making sure that we do things that are additive and not have them feel like we're trying to take influence or power away from them. That's a tricky balance. I think the chief of staff function is a typical function, like the people don't report to you, but you still have to make something happen. And it requires constant kind of understanding building or kind of marketing by the chief of staff team of like, hey, this is what we're adding to the organization. It's not obvious. Everyone's in their own silos and they kind of understand the need for other functional silos, but understanding the need for this cross-functional silo, that doesn't come naturally. And for example, Stella now started a kind of a weekly newsletter on Slack that's been well received to promote that.
Cool. So the reason that came to mind is I think, we're around 200 people. I would imagine a lot of employees at companies, above, 50 people. They're like, we need our CEO to be more focused. The last thing we want is something that enables them to take on more things. So one important function of the chief of staff to me seems it's someone who can give the CEO really honest advice on a regular basis. So like, what does that look like between you two? And still, how do you push back? Sid, what kind of pushback do you like, and how do you show that you're open to that?
With honest advice, it is something that I like to do, and I worked with my team on. I think it's something where I've seen Sid's EBA do it as well, where actually the whole e-group, I think that we try to surface like, this is what's happening in the organization that I think you should be aware of. And we try to make sure that people have that. So I think that's something we do well as a company, and I try to do within this role. As far as pushback, I don't often get it. I think we have pretty open, transparent conversations, and what I care about and what Sid cares about is like the success of the business, and we're aligned on our goals there. So anything that I could do better, I always am very excited about doing. And I think Sid is very similar, like feels the same way. Something that Sid does that I really admire is he does have 360 reviews. He does get board feedback, and he shares that with e-group, including me. And then that's always helpful perspective too, to say like, what does he care about? What is he working on? And then I target a lot of what I think about toward what those goals are.
Close that circle. Stella helped me halfway throughout the year to do kind of send a follow-up. Like, this was the 360 feedback part that was like, work on this, and this is what we did, and this is how we think it's going, like green, yellow, or red. we sent that back to the board, and the board is like, this is the first time ever any CEO has given us an update on like the 360 feedback. Like they normally just get it and never follow up again. So kind of chief of staff makes me look like a much better CEO than I really am, because like I sent that email, but Stella did all the work and she made that ready. And now the board thinks like, well, Sid's a really good CEO, is it? And he has his shit together. Although I told them that Stella did all the work, but it still makes them feel heard and makes it more likely I'll get, they'll invest time in a review next time and allow me to grow.
Cool. So super tactical, but something really interesting. I've got my chief of staff who I'm so excited about starting on January 3rd. Stella, what do you think an amazing first week or month for a chief of staff looks like?
Oh, goodness. Give them a week to plug in their computer, get onto whatever systems, get used to the way that things are working. But something that has been incredible for me is Sid has a CEO shadow program. So 2 people in the company are following in a given week, 90% of his meetings, get access to the documents, the agendas, the one-on-ones. I think something like that is really powerful. So making sure that your chief of staff has an opportunity to actually follow you and understand like your tone, what you care about, what you're working on, and giving that real space. Because there's probably like 10 things you want that person to do immediately. Instead of 10, I'd focus on like 1 or 2 and make sure they have the time to properly onboard.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I've learned a ton from this. It's all very timely. And thank you both for taking some time to walk through. Any other interesting tidbits about the chief of staff role that we didn't cover?
I think one thing, and Sid flashed it on the screen very briefly, but at GitLab, this is a rotational role. So it's 3 years, and then I'll move out of GitLab or something else within GitLab. I'm not sure what that journey is yet, but I think that's something specific to how we've structured it that you can think about too. Like, is this a rotational program where you pull in top leaders and give them an opportunity for a year? Is it something where it's people come in and out? But that's something that's a key dimension for a lot of these roles, and people think about it differently.
Yeah, that's how we're looking at it too.
And yeah, Stella's done such a good job of the role that when in the beginning you bring in chief of staff, your reports are going to be concerned. Like, is the chief of staff going to shield us from the CEO? Is this going to be a layer in between? Am I still going to have access? They're going to, are they interfering with my business? Are they diving? Like, what is this? And then over time, they get used to it. And now we've reached a point where we're now hiring chief of staff to my reports, so chief of staff to the CTO and everything else. So we've gone from skeptics to people who are really convinced of the value and see the need for that for themselves.
That has been great to see.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Stella and Sid.